Portrayed Masculinity in Sports by Kolb, Kurt Farmer, and Brodrick Nickens.
So for our project, we wanted to find out how students at UNL perceive masculinity specific to the sports of wrestling and track and field. And also, this made us want to dig deeper and understand how these athletes in both their specific sports, wrestling and track and field, portray gender themselves.
A little summary of our research and our presentation is first we'll talk about our method, which includes our data collection and data analysis. Then we will go to our results. And after that, we'll go to the summary, which includes our discussion. And after that, we'll go to the limitations, further research for this, and also the conclusion.
So the research questions that we chose to answer in our project, the first was, how do UNL non-athletes perceive wrestling and track and field in terms of masculinity? And this made us want to dig deeper, so we added a second research question of, how do male athletes in wrestling and track and field perform gender within their specific sport?
For our method of data collection, we decided to use the Owen thematic analysis, which will tie in themes to our research. And also, this is qualitative since we did the interviews. What we did was we took 10 students at UNL and we interviewed them. 6 were male students, 4 were female. And we asked them questions about how students define masculinity, their views on masculinity in these sports, and many other questions. A theme when we asked them to define masculinity in sports, nearly all the students interviewed defined masculinity in part of being strong, being powerful, or having muscles. Other themes included them saying competitiveness, not backing down, or best on the team at whatever the sport is. When analyzing our results for our research, 9 out of 10 students believed wrestling was a more masculine sport than track and field. Some of the themes included them saying physical and contact. 7 out of the 10 interviewees used the words physical and contact. As far as violence, 5 out of the 10 interviews used the words violence. And also many of them said strength as well. As for the one person that said track and field was more masculine, they talked about more of the emotional part of masculinity rather than the physical side. I thought that was very interesting.
We hope that these interviews will help determine how the teams portray masculinity traits and gender roles in their sports. Also, our goal is to get enough information from interviewing these athletes to be able to compare similarities and contrast differences. Prior to our interviews and data collection, we watched the preseason videos for both wrestling and track and field to compare and contrast differences in gender and masculinity. Try and pick out a few of your own. We will analyze our findings later in the video when we analyze our second research question. We'll first begin with the Nebraska track and field video.
Even though the white team's going to win, but number 1, Tim. Go Big Red.
You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Go tell that lawman God.
Wrestle hard, people will feel you.
Sometimes you just feel tired, feel weak. And when you feel weak, you feel like you want to just give up. But you gotta search within you, try to find that inner strength value and get that motivation.
A few themes that we picked out while watching the video for track and field were they were aware of the camera, they were wearing Spider-Man outfits, they were smiling, they had tight pants and shirts on, and they were clapping.
Contrary to the themes that we noticed in the track and field, we noticed different themes for wrestling. First, the wrestlers paid no attention to the camera. Second, no matter what the situation was, the athletes were shirtless. Third, there was no outward expression of emotions. So when we were analyzing our results from our interviews with the athletes, we found three major overarching themes. The first was the behavior of the athletes. The second was the attire of the athletes. And the third was the language of the athletes. We'll start with behavior. During our interviews with the wrestlers, all four of them stated how they believed that it was important to behave masculine, not only in front of their team, but in front of their opponents. Taking into account our interviews of the track and field athletes, not one of the four stated that being masculine was directly linked to being successful in their sport. One track and field athlete believed that his teammates were well groomed, while wrestlers behaved more Neanderthal and caveman-like. So we must ask ourselves, what does this difference say about gender performance in sports? We believe the answer to be that the more physical contact with an opponent that the sport requires, the more important it is to perform and maintain masculine identity. Next, we analyze the attire for both wrestlers and track athletes. We learned through our interviews that wrestlers and track athletes had opposing views on what they wore. Wrestlers defined their attire as masculine because it showed off their bodies and their muscles. Track athletes, however, viewed their attire in a different manner. 3 of the 4 track athletes stated that their attire was just neutral. One athlete actually stated that some outside public might even see their attire as feminine. So again we asked, what does this difference say about gender performance in sports? We answered with, wrestlers want to be seen as more masculine, so they view their attire as masculine. Again, portraying masculinity in track was not as important to their success, so they didn't put as much emphasis on how the public viewed their attire, even though virtually the 2 sports wear the same thing. This can be supported in our video from earlier. During the track video, we see athletes dressed up in Spider-Man costumes. This supports the fact that we don't believe that these athletes put as much emphasis on how the public views them. Wrestlers, on the other hand, are seen shirtless in almost every scene of the video. This supports the fact that they believe that muscles are correlated with masculinity. After interviewing all 8 athletes, the final theme that we noticed was the language that they use. Wrestlers use more gendered language, such as tough, hard-nosed, grit, and grind. Track athletes do not use as much gendered language. We did not notice any gender language themes when analyzing the interviews from the track athletes. This again supports the theory that wrestlers try to maintain a masculine identity in all facets of their sport, including their language. Moreover, this again supports our theory that because track athletes don't need to portray themselves as masculine, they don't use as much gendered language.
After analyzing the behavior, the attire, and the language of both sports, we discussed about how our findings had to do with the physical side of masculinity. Besides the one student who spoke out saying track and field was more masculine due to the mental side of the sport, everybody else talked about the physical side of masculinity. We asked ourselves, why does everyone think of masculinity as a physical thing? We all agreed that masculinity needs to be looked at many other lenses than just the physical lens. How do we do this? That brings us to our further research. But before that, we want to discuss and share our limitations of the research.
After researching how gender and masculinity is perceived at UNL, we have realized some of our research limitations, and those being the people that we sampled at UNL. We didn't look outside of UNL's campus. We pretty much only sampled, besides one person, people that were only UNL students and around our same age. Another one of our limitations that we found comes from the sports that we focused on. We only focused on track and wrestling, which those are only two of the major sports that the male sports that we have, male-dominated sports that we have at UNL. I mean, we didn't look at basketball, football, baseball. We didn't look at anything like that. We only focused on track and wrestling, and that's a major limitation, because if we focused on some of the other male sports, we could definitely come up with a different finding. The last limitation that we found was that we only analyzed male-dominated sports. We never looked at how gender or masculinity maybe is even perceived amongst female sports, and how in many of the female sports, I mean, there is still a level of masculinity, and this, I mean, we didn't look at that avenue really at all. I mean, we didn't even come up. And once we got to really thinking about it, I mean, there is a level of masculinity that is around pretty much any sport, whether that be male or female. Now, getting to the further research, we came up with a couple things that we really thought would be good research in the future. One of those would be looking at more the physical side of masculinity, and how that's pretty much all that really anybody looks at is. So out of the people that we interviewed, 5 of those people said that violence and masculinity are connected, and that is how they perceive masculinity, is through violence. Violence is masculinity, and they're 100% connected. And that's not always the case. There are many other lenses that show that violence and masculinity doesn't always have to be the case. Mental side of it is definitely another part that we wanted to focus on, and we thought would be really interested to look at in the future. We're looking at how the media portrays masculinity, and how media portrays, pretty much they solely portray the idea that violence and masculinity is connected, and that if media maybe took on an idea that they wanted to show more of how the mental side of masculinity was a key factor over just showing and just displaying on Top 10 Network, on Hits of the Day, or anything like that, on any major broadcast, maybe showing some of the mental aspect of it, how it's not only violence, but maybe how mentally strong you are, and the strength that has can also be a very big factor in being a masculine person.
In conclusion, we have discussed how male athletes in both wrestling and track and field perform gender within their specific sport at UNL, and also how non-athletes perceive wrestling and track and field in terms of masculinity. We've stated our methods, data collection and analysis. We have talked about the themes that we saw from our research, the results, the limitations, and the further research that could be conducted on our study. Thank you.